Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded hallway of Riverside High School with her head down, clutching her worn backpack against her chest. At 17, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Her long dark hair fell like a curtain around her face, hiding the sharp intelligence in her brown eyes and the small scar that ran along her jawline, a reminder of missions she could never speak about. To her classmates, Sarah was just another quiet transfer student who kept to herself. She ate lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria, never raised her hand in class despite knowing all the answers, and avoided eye contact in the hallways. What they didn't know was that just 2 years ago, Sarah had been Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, one of the youngest female Navy SEALs ever to complete Bud/S training and serve in active combat operations overseas. The decision to leave the military hadn't been easy. After her father was killed in a car accident and her mother fell into severe depression, Sarah chose family over career. She took early discharge to care for her younger brother Miguel and help her mother recover. The government relocated them to this small Colorado town under new identities for security reasons. Sarah had been involved in classified operations that made her a potential target. Now, instead of leading tactical missions against terrorists, she was trying to navigate high school drama and pretend she was just another teenager. It was the hardest mission she'd ever undertaken. "Hey, look who it is," called out Jessica Banks, the school's undisputed queen bee. Jessica was everything Sarah wasn't: blonde, popular, and cruel. She stood in the center of the hallway with her group of followers blocking Sarah's path to her locker. If it isn't the weird new girl who thinks she's too good to talk to anyone. Sarah kept her eyes down and tried to step around them, but Jessica's boyfriend, Brad Thompson, moved to block her way. Brad was the star quarterback, built like a truck and with an ego to match. He towered over Sarah's petite 5'4" frame, flexing his muscles in what he probably thought was an intimidating display. "Where do you think you're going, freak?" Brad sneered. "Jessica was talking to you." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her breathing steady. In her mind, she was already calculating distances, noting Brad's stance and Jessica's position relative to the exits. Old habits died hard. But she forced herself to remain passive. She was Sarah Martinez, quiet high school student, not Lieutenant Martinez, combat specialist. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I just need to get to my locker." Jessica laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the metal lockers. "Oh, she speaks! We weren't sure you knew how. Tell me, Sarah, why don't you ever talk to anyone? Think you're better than us?" The truth was that Sarah had seen things that would give these teenagers nightmares for years. She'd crawled through enemy territory under machine gun fire, taken down armed combatants with her bare hands, and watched good soldiers die in foreign countries most of these kids couldn't find on a map. High school social dynamics seemed trivial by comparison, but she couldn't say any of that. Instead, she shrugged and said, "I'm just shy." "Shy?" Brad repeated mockingly. "Or maybe you're just a weirdo. I bet you don't even have any friends back where you came from. That's why your family had to move here, right? Nobody wanted you around?" Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. These kids had no idea how close to the truth they were, just not in the way they thought. Her team, her real family, was scattered across military bases around the world. The friends she'd made in blood and battle were people she might never see again. The loneliness was sometimes overwhelming. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or what?" Jessica stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming in the narrow hallway. "What are you going to do about it, little mouse? Run home and cry to mommy?" The mention of her mother hit harder than Sarah expected. Her mom was still struggling with depression and anxiety attacks. Some days she barely got out of bed. Sarah was working part-time at a local diner after school to help pay bills while maintaining perfect grades and taking care of Miguel. The stress was constant, but she handled it because she had to. "Please," Sarah said, "I don't want any trouble." "Too late for that," Brad said, reaching out to knock her backpack from her hands. Books scattered across the floor and Sarah's carefully organized notes mixed with homework assignments. Other students had stopped to watch, forming a circle around the confrontation. Sarah knelt to gather her things, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the trembling she allowed to show. Let them think she was scared. It was easier than the alternative. Look at her, Jessica said to her friends. So pathetic. I almost feel sorry for her. She paused dramatically. Almost. As Sarah reached for her chemistry textbook, Brad stepped on her hand. Not hard enough to break anything, but enough to hurt. Sarah froze. Every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. For just a moment, deadly stillness surrounded her. Several students later said they felt a chill, like the temperature in the hallway had suddenly dropped. Brad, oblivious to how close he'd come to having his ankle broken in 3 places, ground his heel slightly. Oops, he said with fake concern. Sorry about that. Sarah slowly pulled her hand free and continued gathering her books. She could feel the stares of dozens of students, some laughing, others looking uncomfortable but doing nothing to help. This was exactly what she'd hoped to avoid. You know what your problem is? Jessica continued, clearly enjoying herself. You think if you just ignore everyone, we'll leave you alone? But that's not how things work here. You're in our school now, and we decide who belongs and who doesn't. Sarah stood up, her backpack rebuilt and secure. She looked directly at Jessica for the first time, and something in her eyes made the popular girl take a small step backward. For just a second, Jessica glimpsed the steel beneath Sarah's quiet exterior. Understood, Sarah said simply. The single word, delivered in a flat tone, somehow carried more weight than any threat could have. Brad felt a strange urge to step back, but forced himself to maintain his position. He was the star athlete, the big man on campus. He wasn't going to be intimidated by some weird, quiet girl. Good, Jessica said, recovering her composure. As long as we understand each other, maybe now you'll learn to show some respect. Sarah turned and walked toward her locker, leaving the group behind. She could hear them laughing and making jokes about her retreat, but she didn't look back. At her locker, she quickly grabbed her books for next period and checked her watch. She had 15 minutes before American history, enough time to splash cold water on her face and center herself. In the bathroom, Sarah stared at her reflection in the mirror. She looked exactly like what she was pretending to be, a scared teenage girl trying to fit in. Her face showed no trace of the warrior underneath. The scar on her jaw was barely visible under makeup, and her calloused hands were hidden by long sleeves. Everything about her appearance had been carefully constructed to hide her true nature. But maintaining the facade was exhausting. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to show these bullies exactly who they were messing with. In any other situation, Brad and Jessica would have found themselves on the ground before they knew what hit them. Sarah had neutralized threats much more dangerous than a couple of entitled teenagers. The problem was that revealing even a fraction of her capabilities would raise questions she couldn't answer. A high school girl didn't move like a trained killer or react to threats with military precision. If she slipped up, even once, it could compromise everything her family had sacrificed for this new life. So she endured. She let them think she was weak because weakness was safe. It was protection for her mother, her brother, and ultimately for herself. The government had made it clear that her new identity depended on maintaining absolute normalcy. Any attention from authorities or unusual incidents would result in immediate relocation, and Sarah couldn't put her family through that trauma again. The bathroom door opened, and a girl named Amy Chen walked in. Amy was one of the few students who hadn't laughed during the hallway incident. She was quiet like Sarah, but in a different way, bookish and studious rather than secretive and guarded. "Are you okay?" Amy asked softly, approaching the sinks. Sarah nodded without looking at her. "I'm fine. Those guys are jerks," Amy continued. "Jessica thinks she runs this place just because her dad owns the biggest car dealership in town. And Brad, well, he's got muscles where his brain should be." Despite herself, Sarah almost smiled. "It's not a big deal." "It is, though." Amy turned to face her. "Nobody should have to put up with that. Have you thought about talking to a teacher or the principal?" Sarah had considered it, but involving authority figures would only create more problems. Official reports meant paperwork, and paperwork led to investigations. The last thing she needed was school administrators digging into her background or calling her mother in for conferences. "I can handle it," Sarah said. Amy looked skeptical but didn't push. Well, if you ever want someone to sit with at lunch or whatever, I'm usually in the library. It's quieter there." "Thanks," Sarah said, and meant it. It was the first genuine kindness anyone at school had shown her. After Amy left, Sarah allowed herself a moment of weakness. She pressed her palms against the cool sink and took several deep breaths. The stress of maintaining her cover was wearing on her more than she'd expected. In the military, she'd always known exactly who she was and what she was fighting for. Here, she was lost in a role that felt increasingly impossible to maintain. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother. "Mom had a bad day. Can you come home after school instead of going to work?" Sarah closed her eyes. Her mother's depression came in waves, and the bad days were getting more frequent. Dr. Reeves said it was normal for grief to manifest in cycles, but watching her strong, independent mother struggle to get dressed some mornings was heartbreaking. She quickly texted back, "Of course. Tell her I love her." Miguel was only 14, but he'd grown up fast since their father's death. He understood that their mother needed patience and support, and he did his best to help. But he was still a kid, and Sarah worried about the burden he was carrying. The bell rang, signaling the end of the break period. Sarah grabbed her backpack and headed to American history, where she would spend the next 50 minutes pretending to learn about wars she'd never be able to discuss her real feelings about. Peterson was a well-meaning teacher who loved to talk about military strategy and heroism, not knowing he had a combat veteran sitting quietly in the back row. As she walked down the hallway, Sarah noticed students moving aside to let her pass. Word of the confrontation with Jessica and Brad had already spread, marking her as either someone to avoid or an easy target for future harassment. She preferred the former but expected the latter. The pattern was already established. Jessica and her crowd had marked Sarah as their victim, and in the cruel ecosystem of high school, that meant open season. Other students would either join in to gain social points or stay away to avoid becoming targets themselves. Sarah had seen similar dynamics in military units where hazing went too far, though the stakes here were different. In class, Sarah took her usual seat in the back corner, where she could watch the exits and keep her back to the wall, another old habit that she couldn't shake. Mr. Peterson was discussing World War II tactics when Brad walked in 10 minutes late, disrupting the lesson with loud apologies and excuses about football practice. "Take your seat, Mr. Thompson," Peterson said with barely concealed irritation. Brad made a show of looking around for an empty chair, though there were several available. His eyes landed on Sarah, and a slow smile spread across his face. He walked directly to the empty seat next to her and dropped into it heavily. "Hey there, neighbor," he whispered, loud enough for surrounding students to hear. "Hope you don't mind the company." Sarah kept her eyes on her notebook and didn't respond. Mr. Peterson had resumed his lecture about strategic bombing campaigns, but she could feel Brad's attention on her like a physical weight. "You know," Brad continued in a low voice, "I think we got off on the wrong foot earlier. I'd like to make it up to you." Sarah's pen paused over her notes. Every instinct told her this was a trap, but she couldn't see the spring mechanism yet. She remained silent. "Maybe you could come to Jessica's party this weekend," Brad suggested. "Might be good for you to get out, meet some people, make some friends." Now Sarah understood. They weren't done with her. The hallway incident had been just the opening move in what Jessica probably saw as a long campaign of social warfare. The party invitation wasn't kindness, it was bait. "I'm busy," Sarah said quietly, still not looking at him. "Busy with what?" Brad pressed. "Sitting at home alone? Come on, don't be like that. Everyone's going to be there." Sarah could imagine exactly what that party would entail. She'd be invited as entertainment, someone for Jessica's crowd to humiliate in front of the entire social hierarchy. They'd probably have drinks, underage drinking that could get her in legal trouble, and engineer situations designed to maximum embarrassment. "I said I'm busy," she repeated, her voice carrying a slight edge that made Brad pause. For a moment, he stared at her profile, trying to figure out what was different about her response. There had been something in her tone, a note of authority that didn't match her submissive behavior in the hallway. But then Sarah deliberately hunched her shoulders and made herself look smaller, and the moment passed. "Your loss," Brad said finally. "But the invitation stands. You know, in case you change your mind and decide to stop being a social reject." The rest of the class passed without incident, but Sarah could feel the attention of other students who had overheard the exchange. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Brad had invited the weird new girl to Jessica's party and been rejected. The social implications would ripple through the school's complex hierarchy, probably making Sarah's situation worse. When the bell rang, Sarah quickly gathered her things and headed for the door, but Brad wasn't finished with her yet. "Sarah," he called out loudly as she reached the hallway. "Don't forget what I said about the party. Last chance to make some friends in this place." Several students stopped to listen, and Sarah felt dozens of eyes watching her response. This was theater for Brad and Jessica's benefit, a public display designed to establish dominance and set expectations for future interactions. "Thank you for the invitation," she said politely, "but I really can't make it." "That's too bad." Jessica's voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to see the popular girl approaching with her usual entourage. "I was hoping you might surprise us and show some personality. Maybe there's more to you than meets the eye." The words seemed innocent enough, but something in Jessica's tone suggested she suspected exactly that. Sarah felt a cold, warning sensation down her spine. Had she already slipped up somehow? Revealed something that didn't fit her cover story? "I'm just not much of a party person," Sarah said carefully. "No?" Jessica agreed, studying her with calculating eyes. "I don't think you are. You're more of a lone wolf type, aren't you? The kind of person who keeps secrets?" Sarah's heart rate increased slightly, but her expression remained neutral. "I don't have any secrets. I'm just quiet." "Everyone has secrets," Jessica said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The question is how interesting they are." The conversation was heading into dangerous territory. Sarah needed to extract herself before Jessica's curiosity led to real investigation. She was smart enough to know that the popular girl wasn't just a pretty face. There was intelligence behind those cold blue eyes, and right now it was focused entirely on Sarah. "I should get to my next class," Sarah said, turning to leave. Of course, Jessica called after her. "Wouldn't want to be late, but Sarah, we should talk more soon. I think we have a lot to learn about each other." Walking away, Sarah felt the weight of Jessica's stare between her shoulder blades. The situation was escalating beyond simple bullying into something more complex and potentially more dangerous. Jessica was clearly someone who enjoyed having power over others, and Sarah's refusal to submit completely had triggered her hunting instincts. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of classes, where Sarah tried to focus on normal teenage concerns while her mind analyzed potential threats and exit strategies. By the time the final bell rang, she had made a decision that went against every protective instinct she possessed. She was going to have to give Jessica and Brad what they wanted, at least partially. Complete resistance would only increase their curiosity and escalate their harassment. But calculated submission, carefully managed, might satisfy their need for dominance while keeping them from digging deeper into her background. It was a dangerous game, but Sarah had played more dangerous ones in places where the stakes were life and death. High school politics might be a different kind of battlefield, but the strategic principles remained the same. Know your enemy, control the terrain, and never reveal your true capabilities until absolutely necessary. As she walked to her beat-up Honda Civic in the student parking lot, Sarah allowed herself one moment of military posture, shoulders back, head high, eyes scanning for threats. Then she consciously slumped back into her teenage disguise and drove home to face whatever crisis was waiting there. The war for her new identity was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez, both versions of her, would need every ounce of training and strength to win it. Sarah arrived home to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at an untouched cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Maria Martinez looked older than her 42 years, her dark hair streaked with premature gray and her brown eyes dull with the weight of grief that never seemed to lift. "Hey, Mom," Sarah said softly, setting down her backpack and moving to the coffee maker. "How was your day?" Maria looked up as if surprised to find someone else in the room. "You're home early. Miguel texted me. He said you were having a rough time." "I'm fine," Maria said automatically, then caught herself. "No, that's not true. I'm not fine. I tried to go grocery shopping today and had a panic attack in the cereal aisle. I left a full cart and just ran." Sarah poured fresh coffee and sat down across from her mother. In the military, she'd been trained to handle crisis situations with calm efficiency, but watching her strong, capable mother struggle with basic daily tasks was harder than any combat mission she'd ever faced. "That's okay," Sarah said. "We have enough food for tonight, and I can go shopping tomorrow after school." "You shouldn't have to take care of everything," Maria said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "You're 17 years old. You should be worried about boys and college applications, not whether your mother can function like a normal human being." "I'm worried about you because I love you," Sarah said firmly. "And taking care of family isn't a burden, it's what we do." The truth was more complicated than that. Sometimes Sarah lay awake at night, wondering what her life would have been like if she'd stayed in the military. Her unit was currently deployed in Syria, facing real dangers while she struggled with teenage bullies and algebra homework. The contrast felt surreal. But then she looked at her mother's fragile state and knew she'd made the right choice. Some battles were fought with weapons, others with patience and love. This was the latter kind, and it was just as important as anything she'd done overseas. "Where's Miguel?" Sarah asked. "Basketball practice. He'll be home around 6. Maria managed a weak smile. "He made varsity, you know. I should be proud, but I can barely manage to feel anything these days." "The doctor said the medication takes time to work," Sarah reminded her. "And grief isn't something you just get over. Dad was everything to all of us." Roberto Martinez had been a police detective, killed by a drunk driver while off duty. His death had shattered their family in ways that were still revealing themselves months later. For Sarah, losing her father had meant losing the one person who knew about her military service and understood the burden she carried. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah looked through the window and saw 2 teenage boys she didn't recognize standing on their front porch. One was tall and thin with nervous energy. The other shorter and stockier with an aggressive stance that immediately put Sarah on alert. "Stay here," she told her mother, moving to the door. Through the peephole, she could see both boys more clearly now. The taller one was fidgeting and looking around as if he didn't want to be there. The shorter one was staring directly at the door with a confident smirk that Sarah had learned to distrust. She opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged, leaving only a small gap. "Can I help you?" "Sarah Martinez?" the shorter boy asked. He had bleached blonde hair and multiple piercings with the kind of attitude that screamed trouble. "I'm Danny Reeves. This is my buddy Kyle. We go to Riverside High." Sarah didn't recognize either of them, which meant they were probably older students or from a different social circle entirely. The fact that they'd found her address was concerning. "What do you want?" she asked. "We heard about your little run-in with Brad Thompson today," Danny said with a grin. "Thought you might want to know that you're not the only one who's had problems with him and his girlfriend."
"I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said carefully.
"Come on," Kyle spoke up for the first time. His voice was high and nervous. "Everyone's talking about how they humiliated you in front of the whole school. Don't you want to do something about it?" Sarah's tactical mind was already working. These boys weren't here out of kindness or solidarity. They had an agenda. And whatever it was, it involved using her as a pawn in some larger game. "I'm not interested," she said, starting to close the door. "Wait," Danny said quickly. "Just hear us out, okay? We know things about Jessica and Brad that could really mess up their perfect little lives. Wouldn't you like to see them get what's coming to them? Such as..." Danny's eyes lit up at her interest. "Well, for starters, Jessica's been cheating on Brad with Tyler Morrison from the college. We've got pictures. And Brad? He's been using steroids for football. Got them from his cousin who works at a gym in Denver." A absorbed this information while keeping her expression neutral. Both pieces of intelligence could indeed cause serious problems for Jessica and Brad. Relationship drama for her, potential criminal charges, and loss of athletic eligibility for him. But getting involved in high school revenge schemes was exactly the kind of attention she needed to avoid. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because we want to take them down," Kyle said, his nervousness making him speak too fast. "They've been running this school like they own it for too long, making everyone else feel like garbage while they act like kings and queens. And you think I'll help because they embarrassed me today?" "That's part of it," Danny admitted, "but also because you're new. Nobody knows much about you, which makes you perfect for certain kinds of operations." The word choice made Sarah's blood run cold. These boys were talking about more than just spreading gossip or posting embarrassing photos online. They were planning something that could have serious consequences. "I'm not interested in getting revenge on anyone," she said firmly. "Find someone else to help with your schemes." "Think about it," Danny pressed. "They made you look weak in front of everyone. Your reputation is already shot. This is your chance to show people that you're not just some pathetic loser they can push around." Sarah felt her jaw clench. These boys had no idea who they were talking to or what she was capable of. The irony of being called weak by teenagers who probably couldn't run a mile without stopping was almost amusing. "My answer is no," she said. "Don't come back here again." She closed the door and locked it, then watched through the window as Danny and Kyle walked back to their car. A beat-up sedan with tinted windows and a suspicious number of antenna attachments. She memorized the license plate number automatically. Another old habit. "Who was that?" her mother asked from the kitchen. "Nobody important," Sarah replied, but her mind was racing. The fact that other students were already planning retaliation against Jessica and Brad suggested the popular couple had made more enemies than just her. It also meant the situation at school was more volatile than she'd realized. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon helping her mother with household tasks and reviewing her own homework. Math came easily. Military logistics required advanced calculation skills. But she had to be careful not to solve problems too quickly or use methods that weren't taught in standard high school curriculum. When Miguel came home from basketball practice, the house felt more normal. At 14, he was tall for his age and shared their father's easy smile and athletic build. He'd adapted to their new life better than either Sarah or their mother, making friends quickly and throwing himself into school activities. "How was practice?" Sarah asked as he raided the refrigerator. "Good. Coach says I might start varsity games next month." He grabbed an apple and leaned against the counter. "How was your day? Make any friends yet?" Sarah hesitated. Miguel didn't know the details about their relocation or her military background, but he was smart enough to sense that their move hadn't been entirely voluntary. He also knew Sarah was struggling with the social aspects of high school life. "Still working on it," she said diplomatically. "You should try out for something," Miguel suggested. "Sports, drama club, whatever. Might be easier to meet people if you have something in common." The suggestion wasn't bad, but Sarah couldn't risk the scrutiny that came with organized activities. Background checks, medical records, emergency contacts, all the paperwork required for school clubs could potentially expose inconsistencies in her cover story. "Maybe," she said noncommittally. That evening, after helping Miguel with his geometry homework and getting their mother settled for the night, Sarah sat on her bed and opened her laptop. She'd been avoiding it for weeks, but tonight she felt the need to check in with her past life. The secure email account she'd used for military communications was technically closed, but Sarah knew ways to access information that didn't appear on official channels. Her former team members occasionally left coded messages on public forums, using references only they would understand. Tonight, there was a new post from someone using the handle desert_eagle_6. Her former squad leader, Master Chief Peterson. The message was disguised as a review for hiking equipment, but embedded in the seemingly random product descriptions was intelligence about their current mission status. Everyone was alive and safe, currently stationed in Kuwait between deployments. They missed her leadership and tactical expertise. The new lieutenant assigned to replace her was competent but lacked her intuitive understanding of enemy movement patterns. Sarah stared at the message for a long time, feeling the familiar ache of separation from the only family she'd known outside of her blood relatives. Those men and women had trusted her with their lives, and she'd trusted them with hers. The bond forged in combat was unlike anything civilian life could offer. But she'd made her choice, and she had to live with it. She closed the laptop and got ready for bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept cycling between concern for her mother, worry about Miguel's adjustment, and strategic analysis of the escalating situation at school. The next morning brought new challenges. Sarah arrived at school to find Jessica and Brad waiting by her locker, along with several members of their extended social circle. The group was large enough to draw attention, but not so large as to constitute obvious harassment. "Good morning, Sarah," Jessica said sweetly as Sarah approached. "We've been waiting for you." Sarah's tactical assessment was immediate and automatic. 8 potential hostiles in a confined space with limited exit routes. Jessica and Brad, flanked by 6 others, including 3 male athletes who could pose physical threats if the situation escalated. Multiple witnesses in the hallway, which could work for or against her depending on circumstances. "What do you want?" Sarah asked quietly. "We heard some interesting rumors yesterday," Brad said, stepping closer. "Something about certain people trying to cause trouble for us. People who might be using information that isn't any of their business." Sarah kept her expression neutral, but internally she was cursing Danny and Kyle's amateur intelligence gathering. They'd obviously been less discreet than they thought, and now Jessica and Brad suspected she was involved in whatever scheme they'd been cooking up. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said honestly. "Really?" Jessica's smile turned predatory. "Because Danny Reeves mentioned your name specifically. Said you were very interested in our personal lives. He came to my house," Sarah said. "I told him I wasn't interested and sent him away." "Whoa. Interesting," Jessica mused. "That's actually exactly what Danny said you'd say, almost like you coordinated your stories." Sarah realized she was being played. Jessica and Brad had probably confronted Danny and Kyle first, gotten their version of events, and were now testing to see if Sarah's story matched. It was actually a fairly sophisticated interrogation technique. "I'm telling the truth," Sarah said. "I don't want any trouble with you or anyone else. I just want to go to class and be left alone." "See, that's the problem," Brad said, moving to block her path to the lockers. "You can't just ignore us and expect everything to be fine. This is our school, and we decide who gets to stay under the radar. What do you want from me?" Sarah asked, allowing a note of desperation to creep into her voice. "Respect," Jessica said simply, "and proof that you're not working with people who want to hurt us." Sarah could feel the trap closing around her. They were going to demand some kind of demonstration of loyalty or submission that would compromise her position even further. She needed to find a way to satisfy their need for dominance while maintaining her cover. "How do I prove that?" she asked. Jessica and Brad exchanged a look that clearly indicated they'd planned for this moment. "There's going to be a party at my house this weekend," Jessica said. "You're going to come, and you're going to help us with something. Consider it a test of your intentions. What kind of help?" Sarah asked, though she was already sure she didn't want to know the answer. "Let's just say we want to make sure Danny and Kyle understand the consequences of spreading rumors," Brad said with a grin that had nothing pleasant in it. Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. They were planning to use the party as cover for retaliation against the 2 boys who'd approached her, and they wanted her involvement to ensure she couldn't betray them without implicating herself. "I don't think," she started to say. "It wasn't a request," Jessica interrupted. "You're going to be there, and you're going to help us send a message, unless you'd prefer we assume you really are working with them and treat you accordingly." The threat was clear: refuse to participate and become a target herself. Agree and become complicit in whatever they had planned for Danny and Kyle. Sarah found herself in an impossible position. Her training told her to extract herself from the situation immediately, but doing so would mean abandoning her cover identity and potentially exposing her family to danger. At the same time, participating in whatever Jessica and Brad had planned could lead to criminal charges or worse. "When is the party?" she heard herself ask. "Saturday night," Jessica said, her smile returning. 8 o'clock. "Don't worry, we'll make sure you know exactly what to do." The group dispersed, leaving Sarah standing alone by her locker with her hands shaking slightly. She'd just agreed to participate in what was essentially a planned assault, and there was no good way out of the situation. For the rest of the day, Sarah moved through her classes in a fog of tactical planning and moral uncertainty. Every training exercise she'd ever participated in had clear objectives and rules of engagement. This was different. A situation where all choices led to compromise and potential disaster. During lunch, she sat alone in her usual corner spot and tried to think of alternatives. She could report Jessica and Brad's plans to school authorities, but without evidence, it would be her word against theirs. She could warn Danny and Kyle directly, but that would confirm her involvement and make her an even bigger target. She could also simply not show up to the party and deal with the consequences. But Jessica had made it clear that would mean open war. Or she could show up and find a way to sabotage their plans without revealing her capabilities. It was the riskiest option, but it might be the only way to protect everyone involved while maintaining her cover. "Mind if I sit?" Amy Chen's voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see the quiet girl from her chemistry class standing with a lunch tray, looking genuinely concerned. "Sure," Sarah said, grateful for the company. Amy sat down and unwrapped a sandwich. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world today. Everything okay?" Sarah almost laughed at the accuracy of that assessment. "Just thinking about stuff." "About what Jessica and Brad did yesterday?" Amy asked, "because everyone's talking about it, and most people think they went too far." "Most people?" Sarah repeated, surprised. "Yeah. I mean, Jessica's crowd thinks it was hilarious, but everyone else either felt bad for you or was just glad it wasn't them getting picked on." Amy took a bite of her sandwich. "Those two have been bullying people for years. You're just their latest target." This was new information. Sarah had assumed the entire school supported or at least tolerated Jessica and Brad's behavior. Knowing that wasn't true changed her tactical assessment significantly. "Has anyone ever stood up to them?" Sarah asked carefully. Amy nodded. "A few people have tried. But Jessica's dad is on the school board, and Brad's family donates a lot of money to the athletic program. Complaints tend to disappear or get turned around on whoever made them." "What about going to the police?" "For what? Being mean? Unless they actually assault someone or commit a crime, there's not much anyone can do." Amy paused. Although there have been rumors about some parties getting out of hand, nothing anyone could prove. But, she trailed off. But Sarah understood the implication. Jessica and Brad's parties weren't just social gatherings. They were venues for more serious misconduct that had been covered up or ignored. "Amy," Sarah said slowly, "if someone was in trouble, hypothetically, and needed help but couldn't go to the authorities, what would you suggest?" Amy studied her for a moment. "Hypothetically? I'd say that person should be very careful about who they trust and what situations they put themselves in. And maybe they should consider that sometimes the best way to help everyone is to find a way to expose the truth." It wasn't a direct answer, but it gave Sarah something to think about. Perhaps there was a way to turn Jessica and Brad's party against them, if she was smart enough and careful enough to pull it off. The rest of the day passed quickly, and soon Sarah was driving home with a plan forming in her mind. It was risky and complex, requiring skills she'd promised herself never to use again. But sometimes the only way to protect innocent people was to become something other than innocent yourself. That night, she began preparing for Saturday's party. Not as Sarah Martinez, quiet high school student, but as Lieutenant Martinez, Navy SEAL. She was going to war again, and this time the battlefield would be a suburban teenager's house party. The quiet girl they'd all dismissed was about to remind them why underestimating your enemy was the first and worst mistake you could make. Saturday evening arrived with the weight of an impending storm. Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, making final adjustments to her appearance. To anyone watching, she looked like a nervous teenager getting ready for her first party. Jeans, a simple sweater, and minimal makeup that made her appear younger and more innocent than her 17 years. But beneath the careful facade, Lieutenant Martinez was conducting final equipment checks. A small recording device disguised as a phone case was clipped to her belt. Her house key had been modified with a tiny blade that could cut zip ties or duct tape in seconds. She wore sneakers with reinforced soles that would give her better traction if she needed to move quickly. Most importantly, she'd spent the week gathering intelligence. Amy Chen had proven to be an unexpected ally, providing details about previous parties at Jessica's house and the layout of the property. Sarah had also done her own reconnaissance, driving past the bank's residence twice to study entry and exit points. "Where did you say you were going tonight?" her mother asked from the doorway. "Study group at Amy's house," Sarah replied, hating the lie but knowing it was necessary. Her mother was having one of her better days, more alert and present than she'd been in weeks. "I'm glad you're making friends," Maria said with a smile that was almost normal. "Your father always worried about you being too serious, too focused on taking care of everyone else." The mention of her father hit Sarah harder than expected. Roberto Martinez had been the one person who understood her drive to serve and protect others, even when it meant personal sacrifice. He would have understood why she was walking into danger tonight. "I'll be home by midnight," Sarah promised, kissing her mother's cheek. The drive to Jessica's house took 15 minutes through winding suburban streets lined with expensive homes. The Banks family lived in the kind of neighborhood where perfection was mandatory and secrets were carefully hidden behind manicured facades. Sarah parked 2 blocks away and walked to the house, noting the vehicles already crowding the circular driveway. Music thumped from inside, and teenagers moved in and out of the front door in a steady stream. To all appearances, it was a typical high school party, but Sarah's trained eyes picked up details others would miss. The way certain boys positioned themselves near doorways, blocking casual exit routes. The nervous energy of several guests who kept checking their phones and looking toward the back of the house. The fact that no adults seemed to be present despite neighbors being close enough to complain about noise. Sarah. Jessica's voice cut through the crowd as soon as she entered the house. I'm so glad you made it. Come on, let me introduce you to everyone. Jessica was playing the perfect hostess, but Sarah caught the calculating look in her eyes. This was theater, designed to put Sarah at ease before springing whatever trap had been prepared. Sarah allowed herself to be led through the crowded living room, noting faces and positions automatically. Danny Reeves and Kyle were indeed present, both looking uncomfortable and out of place among the popular crowd. They stood near the kitchen, nursing beer bottles and glancing nervously at Brad, who was holding court near the back patio. Isn't this fun? Jessica asked loudly, making sure nearby guests could hear. Sarah was so shy about coming tonight, but I told her she needed to get out more, make some real friends. The emphasis on real friends was clearly directed at Danny and Kyle, who both looked up at the sound of Sarah's name. Their expressions shifted from nervousness to suspicion as they realized she had actually shown up to the party. Sarah! Brad's booming voice carried across the room as he approached with a red plastic cup in each hand. Glad you decided to join us. Here, have a drink. Sarah accepted the cup, but didn't drink from it immediately. In her peripheral vision, she noticed several of Brad's football teammates moving to casual positions around the room. Whatever they had planned was about to begin. Thanks, she said, keeping her voice quiet and submissive. This is a really nice house. Wait until you see the basement, Jessica said with a smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. We've got games set up down there. Brad, why don't you show Sarah around while I get things organized up here? Sarah recognized the separation tactic immediately. They wanted to isolate her from potential witnesses before revealing their true intentions. She needed to buy time and gather more information about their exact plans. Actually, she said quickly, could I use the bathroom first? I'm a little nervous. Of course! Jessica's smile became more genuine. Down the hall, second door on the right. Take your time. Sarah made her way through the crowd, hyper-aware of the eyes tracking her movement. In the bathroom, she quickly activated her recording device and checked her phone. She'd programmed Amy's number for emergency use, though she hoped it wouldn't come to that. She also used the opportunity to study the house layout more carefully. The bathroom window opened onto the side yard, providing an emergency exit if necessary. The hallway led back to the main living area, but also connected to what looked like a home office with a back door. When she emerged from the bathroom, Brad was waiting for her with that same predatory smile. Ready for that tour? He asked, gesturing toward a door at the end of the hall. Sarah nodded and followed him down a carpeted staircase into a finished basement. The space was clearly designed for entertaining: pool table, large television, wet bar, and several seating areas. But what caught Sarah's attention were the soundproofing panels on the walls and the fact that all the windows had been covered with heavy curtains. Nice setup, she said, her voice carefully neutral. My dad had it done when I was in middle school, Brad said, moving to the wet bar. Said every man needs a space where he can relax without worrying about neighbors complaining. The implication was clear. Whatever happened in this basement stayed in this basement. Footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of Jessica and 4 other members of their inner circle. Sarah recognized all of them from school, athletes and cheerleaders who formed the core of the popular crowd's power structure. Sorry to keep you waiting, Jessica said brightly. We just needed to make sure our other guests were comfortable upstairs. Other guests? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Danny and Kyle, Brad confirmed. They should be joining us any minute. As if summoned by his words, more footsteps echoed on the stairs. Danny and Kyle appeared, flanked by 2 more football players who were clearly acting as escorts rather than friends. What's going on? Danny demanded, looking around the basement with growing alarm. Why did you want us to come down here? Just a little party game, Jessica said sweetly. A chance for all of us to get better acquainted. Sarah's tactical mind was racing through possible scenarios. With 6 potential hostiles in a contained space and 3 civilians, including herself, the odds were heavily stacked against any kind of resistance. But something about the setup felt wrong, too elaborate for simple intimidation. "What kind of game?" Kyle asked nervously. "Truth or dare," Brad announced with obvious enjoyment, but with a twist. "See, we've been hearing some very interesting rumors about what certain people have been saying about us. Rumors that could hurt our reputations if they spread." Sarah felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just about intimidation or even assault. They were planning to record confessions or compromising material that could be used for blackmail. "I don't know what you're talking about," Danny said, but his voice cracked with fear. "Sure you do." Jessica moved closer, her friendly mask finally slipping. "You approached Sarah here with some very specific allegations about Brad and me. Things that could only have come from someone with access to private information. That's not—" Kyle started to protest. "Shut up," one of the football players said sharply. "You'll get your turn to talk." Sarah realized the situation was about to escalate beyond anything she could control through passive resistance. These teenagers were planning something that could have serious legal and personal consequences for everyone involved, including themselves. But she also understood that revealing her capabilities now would expose her cover and potentially put her family at risk. She needed to find a way to neutralize the threat without showing her hand. "Jessica," she said quietly, "maybe we should just go back upstairs. This doesn't seem like a good idea." "Oh, but it's a great idea," Jessica replied. "You see, we need to make sure all 3 of you understand the importance of loyalty, of keeping your mouths shut about things that aren't your business." "And if we don't?" Danny asked with more bravado than sense. Brad stepped forward, flexing his considerable muscles. "Then we help you understand. See, here's what's going to happen. You're going to admit, on camera, that you made up those stories about us. You're going to apologize for trying to cause trouble, and then you're going to promise never to speak about us again. And if we refuse?" Kyle's voice was barely above a whisper. "Then things get unpleasant," Jessica said simply. "My dad's law firm has some very talented private investigators. They can make life very difficult for people who cause problems for our family. Background checks, credit reports, immigration status. You'd be surprised what can be uncovered with the right resources." The threat hit Sarah like a physical blow. Immigration status. Jessica was implying she had the power to investigate family backgrounds, which could expose the Martinez family's false identities and destroy everything they'd sacrificed for. Sarah felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest. These teenagers had just crossed a line from harmless bullying into territory that could endanger her mother and brother. That changed everything. "What do you want us to say?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully submissive while her mind shifted into combat planning mode. "Smart girl," Jessica said approvingly. "Brad, set up the camera. Let's get this done." While Brad moved to set up a video camera on a tripod, Sarah conducted a final tactical assessment. 6 hostiles, various sizes and capabilities. The largest threats were Brad and his 2 teammates, all football players with size and strength advantages. But they were also teenagers who'd never faced real resistance, let alone someone with actual combat training. Jessica and her 2 female accomplices were smaller but potentially more dangerous, because they were clearly the tactical planners of the group. Jessica, in particular, had demonstrated intelligence and ruthlessness that made her a priority target if the situation deteriorated. The basement layout worked both for and against her. The space was large enough for movement but contained enough to limit options. Multiple pieces of furniture could be used as weapons or shields. The staircase was the primary exit, but Sarah had noted the covered windows that could potentially provide alternate escape routes. Most importantly, she was no longer just Sarah Martinez, quiet high school student. The moment Jessica had threatened her family's safety, she'd become Lieutenant Martinez, Navy SEAL, with all the training and experience that entailed. "Okay," Brad announced. "We're rolling. Danny, you're up first." Danny looked around desperately, clearly hoping someone would intervene. When no help came, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "What am I supposed to say?" he asked. "Tell the truth," Jessica said with false kindness. "Tell everyone that you made up stories about Brad taking steroids and about me cheating on him. Tell them you're sorry for spreading lies. Danny looked at Kyle, then at Sarah, seeking some sign of support or resistance. Sarah met his eyes and gave the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. Danny started, then stopped. I can't do this. Sure you can, Brad said, moving closer. It's easy. Just read from the script Jessica wrote for you. He held out a piece of paper, but Danny knocked it from his hand. No, I won't lie for you. Everyone should know what you really are. The room went very still. Jessica's mask of civilized behavior finally cracked completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. Brad, she said quietly, I think Danny needs some motivation. Brad grinned and started forward, but Sarah was already moving. Years of training kicked in as she stepped between Brad and Danny, her entire posture shifting from submissive to predatory in the space between heartbeats. I don't think that's necessary, she said, and her voice carried a note of authority that made everyone in the room pause. Sarah? Jessica asked uncertainly. What are you doing? Stopping this before someone gets seriously hurt, Sarah replied. Her eyes locked on Brad, who was still advancing despite her intervention. Get out of the way, freak, Brad snarled, reaching out to push her aside. It was the last mistake he would make that evening. Sarah caught his wrist as he reached for her, using his own momentum and a basic Aikido throw to send him crashing into the pool table. The impact was loud and decisive, and Brad's surprised grunt of pain echoed through the basement. For a moment, everyone stared in shock. The quiet, submissive girl they'd all dismissed had just taken down the biggest, strongest person in the room without apparent effort. What the hell? One of the football players started to say, moving towards Sarah. She turned to face him, and something in her stance made him stop mid-sentence. Sarah Martinez was no longer pretending to be a harmless teenager. Every line of her body spoke of training, experience, and the absolute confidence that came from having faced death and survived. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she said calmly. You all seem to think I'm the same scared little girl you cornered in the hallway. That was a mistake. Jessica had gone very pale. What are you? Someone you really shouldn't have threatened, Sarah replied. Brad was pulling himself up from the floor, his face red with rage and embarrassment. You little bitch. He lunged at her again, this time with real intent to hurt. Sarah sidestepped smoothly and drove her elbow into his solar plexus, doubling him over. A quick knee to his face sent him crashing back to the floor, blood streaming from his nose. The other football players started forward, but Sarah was ready for them. The first one was bigger than Brad but slower, and Sarah used his size against him, tripping him into a painful face-first meeting with the basement floor. The second one actually managed to grab her, but a sharp elbow to his ribs and a heel stomp to his instep convinced him to let go very quickly. In less than 30 seconds, 3 of the strongest people in the room were on the ground, groaning in pain. The rest of Jessica's crew had backed against the far wall, staring at Sarah with expressions of pure terror. Now, Sarah said, brushing imaginary dust off her sweater, let's talk about what's really going to happen here. She walked over to the video camera and calmly deleted the footage Brad had started recording. Then she turned to face Jessica, who was pressed against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. You made several threats tonight, Sarah said conversationally. Threats against Danny, Kyle, and myself. You also mentioned having people investigate family backgrounds and immigration status. That was particularly interesting. Jessica opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Here's what's going to happen instead, Sarah continued. You're all going to forget this party ever happened. You're going to leave Danny, Kyle, and me alone. You're going to stop bullying other students at school. And most importantly, you're never going to threaten my family again. Who are you? Jessica whispered. Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm exactly who I said I was. A quiet girl who just wants to be left alone. But I'm also someone who's very good at protecting the people she cares about. She moved closer to Jessica, close enough that only she could hear the next words. If you or anyone else ever threatens my family again, you'll discover that there are much worse things in this world than high school bullies. Some of us have seen real darkness, and we're very good at bringing it back when necessary. Jessica nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. Good, Sarah said, stepping back. Now, I think it's time for everyone to go home. Danny, Kyle, you should leave first. I'll make sure no one follows you. The two boys hurried up the stairs without looking back. Sarah turned her attention to the rest of the group. Can any of you drive safely? She asked, noting that several of them had been drinking. One of the girls nodded shakily. I'm the designated driver. Excellent. Take everyone home. Make sure they all get medical attention if needed. She looked pointedly at Brad, who was still bleeding from his broken nose. As the group stumbled up the stairs, Jessica lingered behind. Please, she said desperately, please don't tell anyone what happened here. My father, if he finds out, that depends on you, Sarah replied. Follow the rules I just gave you, and this stays between us. Break them, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are. Jessica nodded and hurried after her friends, leaving Sarah alone in the basement. She took a moment to center herself, pushing the combat adrenaline down and returning to her civilian mindset. The quiet girl was back, but everyone who'd been in that basement would remember what lay beneath the surface. They would remember, and they would be very careful never to wake it again. Sarah retrieved her phone and called Amy. Hey, it's me. Could you pick me up? The party ended earlier than expected. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in Amy's car, looking like any other teenager who'd had a disappointing social experience. How was it? Amy asked as they drove through the quiet suburban streets. Educational, Sarah replied. I don't think I'll be going to many more parties, though. That bad? Sarah looked out the window at the peaceful neighborhood, thinking about the chaos she'd left behind and the complex web of consequences that would follow. Let's just say I learned a lot about myself tonight, she said finally. And I think some other people did too. By Monday morning, the story had spread through Riverside High like wildfire, though the details varied wildly depending on who was telling it. Some said there had been a massive fight at Jessica's party. Others claimed the police had broken it up. A few whispered that Jessica Banks had transferred schools, though she was actually present for first period, pale and subdued, but trying to maintain her normal routine. What everyone agreed on was that something had fundamentally changed. Jessica and Brad's reign of terror over the school's social hierarchy had ended as suddenly as it had begun. They still sat at their usual table, still commanded their usual crowd, but the edge was gone. When underclassmen walked past, they no longer flinched in anticipation of cruel comments. And Sarah Martinez? She remained the quiet girl in the back of the classroom, unremarkable and forgettable to most observers. But now there were whispers about her, too. Rumors that the shy transfer student wasn't quite what she seemed. Amy Chen noticed the change immediately when she saw Sarah at her locker Monday morning. You look different, Amy observed. Different how? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. More relaxed, I guess. Like you're not carrying as much weight as before. Sarah considered this as she organized her books. It was true that she felt more settled, more at peace with her dual identity than she had since arriving in town. Maybe I just had a good weekend, she said with a small smile. Maybe, Amy agreed, but her expression suggested she suspected there was more to the story. As Sarah walked to her first class, she noticed other students looking at her with new interest. Not the cruel curiosity that had marked Jessica and Brad's attention, but something closer to respect. Word had clearly spread that the quiet girl was not to be underestimated. She'd found a way to protect her cover while still protecting the people who mattered. It wasn't perfect. There would always be questions and suspicions, but it was sustainable. She could live with being known as someone who should be left alone, as long as her family remained safe. During lunch, Danny Reeves approached her table hesitantly. Sarah, he said quietly, could I talk to you for a minute? Sarah nodded, and Danny sat down across from her. He looked nervous but determined. I wanted to thank you, he said, for Saturday night. Kyle and I, we know you could have just looked the other way. Everyone deserves to feel safe at school, Sarah replied simply. Yeah, but... Danny paused, choosing his words carefully. What you did, the way you handled yourself, that wasn't normal. I mean, no offense, but you're not exactly built like a fighter. Sarah met his eyes steadily. Sometimes people are more than they appear to be. I guess so. Danny was quiet for a moment. Are you going to be okay? I mean, Jessica and Brad might try to get back at you. I don't think that's going to be a problem, Sarah said with quiet confidence. She was right. Over the following weeks, Jessica and Brad's behavior changed dramatically. They were still popular, still dated, still attended the same parties and social events, but the casual cruelty that had defined their interactions with other students simply stopped. Sarah never learned exactly what they told their friends about that night, but whatever story they'd settled on, it apparently involved everyone agreeing never to speak about it again. Jessica would sometimes look at Sarah across the cafeteria with an expression of lingering fear and confusion, but she never approached her again. More importantly for Sarah, the constant stress of maintaining her cover while facing daily harassment finally lifted. She could focus on her studies, help her mother recover, and support Miguel's adjustment to their new life. Maria Martinez's depression began to improve around the same time, though she attributed it to the medication finally taking effect, rather than any change in their circumstances. Miguel made the varsity basketball team and started bringing friends home from school. Their small family was healing. Sarah continued to check her military contacts occasionally, but the urgent need to reconnect with her past life faded. She was building something new here, something that honored both versions of herself. The quiet girl and the warrior could coexist, she discovered. Sometimes protecting people meant using violence, and sometimes it meant choosing not to. Wisdom lay in knowing the difference. As winter turned to spring, Sarah found herself looking forward to graduation and the possibility of college. For the first time since leaving the military, she could imagine a future that didn't require her to choose between her family and her sense of purpose. She would always be ready to fight when necessary. But she'd also learned that the strongest victories sometimes came from knowing when not to fight at all. The girl they'd targeted for being quiet had taught them all a lesson about the difference between weakness and restraint. And in doing so, she'd finally found a way to be both Sarah Martinez, high school student, and Lieutenant Martinez, Navy SEAL. She was exactly who she'd always been. Someone who protected the people she loved, no matter what form that protection needed to take.